and welcome back to Shakespeare Sunday. My name's Miss Douglas, and this week we're going to be reading William Shakespeare's Macbeth as rewritten by Andrew Matthews and Tony Ross. It is set in the 11th century Scotland, so the 1000s if you wish to say. Our main characters that we're going to be reading through today are the three witches of the Weird Sisters, Macbeth, who begins the story as the Thane of Glamis and general to King Duncan, Lady Macbeth, who's the wife to Macbeth, Banquo, another general to King Duncan, then King Duncan, obviously, King of Scotland. We have Malcolm and Donalbain, who are the king's sons, Macduff, who's the Thane of Fife. There's a random servant thrown in there, and a couple of murderers as well. Macbeth can be a little bit complicated to get your head around, but my synopsis of the plot is that Macbeth is given a prophecy. The witches tell him that eventually one day he will be given the title of King of Scotland, and then he gets really excited, and so then he tells his wife, and then their heads and egos just go, oh my gosh, we could rule Scotland, and basically they do what it takes to achieve that and maintain that. Similar lines to Richard III from last week, but more sorcery involved. This is a reading of Macbeth. All day, the three witches waited on the edge of the battlefield. Hidden by mist and magic, they watched the Scottish army win a victory over the invading forces of Norway, and after the fight was done, they lingered on, gloating over the moans of the dying. As thunder rolled overhead and rain lashed down, one of the witches raised her long, hooked nose to the wind and sniffed like a dog taking a scent. "He will be here soon," she said. The second witch stroked the tuft of silvery hair that sprouted from her chin and grinned, showing her gums. "I hear the sound of hooves, sisters," she said. The third witch held up a piece of rock, crystal, in front of her milky blind eyes. Inside the crystal something seemed to move. "I see him," she screeched. "Here he comes! Let the spell begin." Two Scottish generals rode slowly away from the battlefield, and their heads lowered against the driving rain. One was Macbeth, the Thane of Glamis, the bravest soldier in King Duncan's army. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a warrior's face, broken-nosed and scarred from old fights. His companion and friend Banquo was younger and slimmer, with a mouth that was quick to smile, although he wasn't smiling now. Macbeth's dark eyes were distant as he recalled the details of the day's slaughter. A hard fight to protect an old, feeble king, he thought. If I ruled Scotland. His mind drifted off into a familiar daydream. He saw himself seated on the throne, with the golden crown of Scotland circling his brow. Suddenly his horse reared and whinnied, its eyes rolling in terror. Macbeth struggled to control the horse, and at that moment a bolt of lightning turned the air violet. In the eerie light he saw three weird hags barring the way, their wild hair and ragged robes streaming like tattered flags in the wind. Macbeth's hand flew to his sword, but Banquo hissed out an urgent warning. "No, my friend, I do not think swords can harm creatures like these." A small, cold fear entered Macbeth's heart, and he snarled to conceal it. "What do you want?" he demanded of the witches. "Stand aside." Moving as one, the witches raised their left arms and pointed crooked fingers at Macbeth. They spoke, and their voices grated like iron on stone. "All hail Macbeth, Thane of Glamis! All hail Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor! All hail Macbeth, who shall be king!" Macbeth gave a startled gasp. How had these withered crones come to read his secret thoughts? The witches turned their fingers to Banquo. "All hail Banquo," they chanted. "Your children shall be kings." and then they vanished like a mist of breath on a mirror. Were they ghosts? Banquo whispered in amazement. They were mad women, snorted Macbeth. How can I be Thane of Cawdor? He's alive and well and one of King Duncan's most trusted friends. And how could my children be kings if you took the throne? Banquo asked. The sound of hoofbeats made both men turn their heads. Out of the rain appeared a royal herald. He pulled his horse to a halt and lifted a hand in salute. I bring great news, he announced. The Thane of Cawdor has confessed to treason and has been executed. The king has given his title and lands to you, noble Macbeth. He has proclaimed you as his heir after his sons Malcolm and Donalbain. All hail Macbeth, Thane of Glamis and Cawdor. Macbeth's face turned deathly pale. So the witches told the truth, he thought. Only Duncan and his sons stand between me and the crown. My wife must know of this. I will write to her tonight. Macbeth was so deep in thought that he didn't notice the troubled look that Banquo gave him. The witches had left a scent of evil in the air, and Banquo seemed to smell it clinging to his friend. Lady Macbeth stood at the window of her bedchamber, gazing out at the clouds gathering above the turrets of Glamis Castle. In her right hand she held the letter from her husband, and its words echoed through her mind. Glamis Cawdor King, you could have them all, she whispered. But I know you too well, my lord. You want greatness, but you shrink from what you must do to get it, if only. There was a knock at the door. Lady Macbeth started and turned, her long black hair whispering against the green silk of her gown. Come, she called. A servant entered. A message from Lord Macbeth, my lady, he said. He bids you prepare a royal banquet for the king. We'll stay at Glamis tomorrow night. What? Lady Macbeth gasped in amazement. Are you mad? She quickly recovered herself. Go tell the other servants to make ready for the king, she commanded. When she was alone again, Lady Macbeth opened the window and a blast of cold air caught her hair and swirled it around her face. Fate leads Duncan to Glamis, she murmured. Sorry. Come to me, powers of darkness. Fill me with cruelty, so I may teach my husband how to be ruthless. A low growl of thunder answered her. Macbeth rode ahead of the king's party and arrived at Glamis just after sunrise. When his wife greeted him, he noticed a hard, determined look in her eyes. The king sleeps here tonight, he said. Is his room ready? All is ready. For Duncan's last night on earth, said Lady Macbeth. What do you mean? Macbeth asked. Lady Macbeth moved closer and spoke in a low voice. I guess the thoughts that lay behind your letter, she said. Duncan is old and weak. His sons are not fit to rule, but you are. Kill the king when he sleeps, and let Malcolm and Donalbain bear the blame. Macbeth was astonished. First the witches, and now his wife had seen his innermost thoughts. Some strange force seemed to have taken control of his life, and he fought against it. I will never commit murder and treason, he declared. I will put a sleeping potion in a jug of wine and send it to the guards at the king's door, Lady Macbeth said quickly. They will sleep like babes. It will be easy for you to slip into Duncan's room. No, I cannot, Macbeth groaned. Lady Macbeth's face twisted into a sneer. This is your real chance to be king, she said. Are you too cowardly to take it? I am no coward, snapped Macbeth. Then prove it, Lady Macbeth hissed. Kill the old man and take the throne. Once more the strange force moved through Macbeth, flowing into him from his wife, until he was unable to resist. All hail Macbeth, who shall be king, he thought, and he could almost feel the crown upon his head. Long after the castle had fallen silent, Macbeth left his room and crept along the corridors. His hands trembled, and the sound of his pulse in his ears was like the beating of a battle drum. This is the hour of the wolf and the witch, he thought. when evil spirits roamed the night. And as the words crossed his mind, a ghostly glow gathered in the darkness, shaping itself into a dagger that floated in the air, shining with a sickly green light. Macbeth almost cried out in terror. "Be calm," he told himself. "This is a trick of the mind." To prove it, he reached out his hand to take the dagger, but it floated away from him and pointed the way to Duncan's door. Blood began to ooze from the blade as the iron were weeping red tears. A bell tolled midnight. "Duncan's funeral bell is ringing," muttered Macbeth, and he followed the dagger through the gloom. Lady Macbeth also heard the bell toll, and it seemed a long time before her husband returned. There was blood on his face and hands, and he carried 2 daggers. "You should not have brought the daggers here," said Lady Macbeth. "Go back and put them into the guard's hands as we planned." Macbeth's eyes were blank. He shook his head. "I will not go back there," he said hoarsely. "Then I will," said Lady Macbeth, and snatched the daggers from Macbeth's hands and left the room. Macbeth stood where he was, shivering uncontrollably, seeing nothing but Duncan's dead eyes staring. He tried to pray, but his lips and tongue would not form the words. In a short while, Lady Macbeth came back, holding her red hands up to the candlelight. "I smeared the blood over the guards' faces to make them seem guilty," she said. "In the morning we will have them tortured until they say that Duncan's son paid them to kill him." Her face was so full of triumph and cruelty that Macbeth no longer recognised it. He turned away and caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. It was as if he was looking at someone else, as if he and his wife had become strangers to themselves and each other. Glamis Castle was awoken in the grey light of dawn by voices shouting, "Murder! The king is slain!" Shocked guests ran from their rooms and spoke in whispers. Who could have murdered the king? Rumours flew through the castle like swallows, and suspicion fell on Malcolm and Donalbain, who had the most to gain from their father's death. Malcolm and Donalbain were convinced that Macbeth was the murderer, but they did not dare to accuse him. Who would believe that the hero of the battle against the Norwegians would slay his own king? Though they knew it would be taken as proof of their guilt, Duncan's sons fled for their lives. Donalbain sailed for Ireland, and Malcolm rode across the border into England to put himself under the protection of the English king. Now nothing stood between Macbeth and the throne. He was crowned, but the crown did not bring him the pleasure he had imagined. His secret dream had come true, but he was disturbed by other dreams. Dreams of what the witches had foretold for Banquo's descendants. "Have I lied and murdered to set Banquo's spawn on the throne?" he brooded. "I must find a way to rid myself of him and his son." A dark plan formed in Macbeth's mind, and he kept it a secret, even from Lady Macbeth. Without either of them realising, the strange force that had compelled them to kill Duncan was slowly driving them apart. Macbeth held a coronation feast in the royal castle at Dunsinane. Many of the nobles who had attended remarked that Macbeth's old friend Banquo was not present, but Macbeth laughed when they mentioned it. "Lord Banquo and his son must have been delayed on their way," he said lightly. Only he knew what had delayed them, for he had hired 2 murderers to ambush them on the road. At the height of the feast, a servant brought Macbeth a message that 2 men wished to see him on urgent business. Macbeth hurried to his private chambers and found the murderers waiting there. "Have you done what I paid you to do?" Macbeth demanded. "Banquo is dead, my lord," one of the murderers said. "We cut his throat and threw the body into a ditch." Macbeth sighed with relief. Perhaps now he would sleep peacefully. But then he sensed something wrong. Neither of the murderers would look at him, and they kept anxiously shuffling their feet. "And his son?" said Macbeth. The reply was shattering. "He escaped, my lord. Banquo's son still lives." As he returned to the banqueting hall, doubts tortured Macbeth like scorpion stings. "Banquo's son still lives," he thought. "Lives to take his revenge on me, to claim the throne and father." sons who will rule after him? Is there no end to the blood that must be shed before I find peace?" As he entered the hall, Macbeth put on a false smile to hide his troubled mind, but the smile froze when he saw a hooded figure seated in his chair. "Who dares to sit in my place?" he roared. The guests fell silent and looked bewildered. The king's chair was empty. "Why, no one, my lord," said Lady Macbeth with a forced laugh. She could see that something was wrong with her husband, but she could not guess what. "The king is jesting," she told the nobles. "This is no jest," barked Macbeth. He strode angrily towards the figure, then recoiled in horror as it drew back its hood. For what he saw was Banquo, with weed tangled in his hair and mud streaked across his face, with a deep gash in his neck that sent a stream of blood pattering onto the flagstones, and haunting, glassy eyes that stared and stared. "Get rid of him!" Macbeth screeched. The nobles sprang to their feet, drawing their daggers, knocking over chairs and wine cups in the confusion. "Back to your grave!" sobbed Macbeth. Banquo smiled. There was blood in his mouth, and his teeth shone white through it. Then he faded into the shadows in the torchlight. "My lords, the king is ill," Lady Macbeth said desperately. "Leave us now and let him rest. In the morning, he will be himself again." "Myself?" Macbeth moaned softly to himself. "I will not be myself again until Banquo's spirit is laid to rest. Only the witches can set me free." The witches were seated in a huddle around a fire over which a cauldron bubbled. In the sky above their heads a full moon sailed, casting silver light over the battlefield, still littered with unburied corpses. The blind witch held up her crystal. Deep inside, a tiny horse and rider galloped wildly through the night. "Here he comes," she cackled. "The spell is still strong." And Macbeth came out of the moonlight, his horse's flanks white with lathered sweat. He climbed from the saddle and was about to speak when the hook-nosed witch called out, "The king wishes to know the future." "It is not for the faint-hearted," warned the bearded witch. "I have courage enough," Macbeth growled. The blind witch dipped a wooden cup into the cauldron and held it out. "Drink," she said. Macbeth took the cup and lifted it to his lips, shuddering as he swallowed. Fire and ice in the light of the moon burned in his brain. The blind witch's face melted like the edge of a cloud, and became the face of Duncan, his silver hair dark with blood. "Beware Macduff, the Thane of Fife," Duncan said, and then he changed into Banquo. "No man born of a woman can harm you," Banquo said. "You will rule until Birnam Wood walks to Dunsinane." "Then I am safe," cried Macbeth. "No one can stop me." And he was alone. The witches, their cauldron and the fire had vanished. It was the start of a fearful time. On his return to Dunsinane, Macbeth ordered that Macduff be arrested. When he heard that Macduff had fled to England to join Malcolm, Macbeth had Macduff's castle burned and his wife and children put to death. From then on, anyone who questioned the king's commands, no matter how harsh or unjust those commands might be, was executed. The gap between Macbeth and his wife grew wider. The guilty secret of Duncan's murder gnawed at Lady Macbeth's mind like a maggot inside an apple. She fell ill and began to walk in her sleep, dreaming that she and Macbeth were still covered with Duncan's blood. "Out, damned stain," she croaked. "Will nothing make me clean?" Doctors could do nothing for her, and she grew weaker every day. Then at last hope came to Macbeth's suffering subjects. Malcolm had raised an army in England, and with Macduff at his side, he marched his troops into Scotland. There the army was greeted by cheering crowds who longed to be freed from the tyrant Macbeth. First Glamis Castle was captured and burned, and then Malcolm's forces marched on to Dunsinane. To the despair of Macbeth's generals, he did nothing. Each time they advised him to go to battle, he laughed and said, "I have nothing to fear until the day that Birnam Wood walks to Dunsinane." Through the windows of the throne room, Macbeth could see the distant campfires of Malcolm's army. He raised a cup of wine to them. "Fools," he jeered, "you cannot overthrow me." A sound made him turn. A servant was standing at the door, wringing his hands and weeping. "What is it?" Macbeth said gruffly. "The Queen, my lord," said the servant. She is dead." For a long time Macbeth was silent, remembering the early years of his marriage when the world had seemed bright. "Life goes on day after day, but it means nothing," he said in a cracked whisper. "It ends in despair and darkness and death." Macbeth did not sleep that night. He drank cup after cup of wine, but it brought him no comfort. Only the certainty that his enemies would be defeated and that he would remain unharmed gave him any hope. At dawn, an anxious-faced captain brought the king strange news. "The enemy is approaching, my lord," he said. "To conceal the strength of their numbers, they are hiding behind branches cut from burning wood. It looks as though a forest is coming on the march." "My curse upon you, witches!" howled Macbeth. "You deceived me. I have lost everything, but at least I can die like a soldier with a sword in my hand. Go tell the servants to bring me my armour." It was a short battle. Macbeth's army had no stomach for a fight to protect a king they now hated, and the soldiers began to surrender to Malcolm's men, first in a trickle, then in a flood. Macbeth fought recklessly, as though he wished to be killed, but he hacked down opponent after opponent, shouting, "You were born of woman," as he delivered the death blow. At last, Macbeth found himself alone. He was resting against a cart when he heard someone call his name. It was Macduff, striding through the smoke of battle, his broadsword at the ready. "I have come to avenge my wife and children," Macduff said through clenched teeth. "Stay back," warned Macbeth. "I cannot be harmed by a man born of woman." "My mother died before I was born," said Macduff, his eyes blazing with hate. "To save me, the doctor cut me from her body." Macbeth threw his head back and laughed bitterly. He saw now that all the witch's promises had been lies, and that by believing them he had betrayed himself. The force that had dominated him was gone, and only his courage remained. "Come then, Macduff," he cried. "Make an end of me." Macduff struck off Macbeth's head with a single sweep of his sword. The head was placed on top of a spear that had been driven into the ground outside the gates of Dunsinane. The victorious army cheered, then marched away to see Malcolm crowned king. As the sun set, 3 ravens flapped down from the castle walls and fluttered around Macbeth's head. "All hail Macbeth," they called. "All hail, all hail." The theme that I explored during this is the theme of evil. So that the evil that's represented in this is that evil, well, the potential for evil rather, is within everyone. The evil is mainly within Macbeth's personality change, because at the beginning he's quite hesitant, he doesn't know what to do, and then going through it at the end, he's murdering multiple people to maintain the throne, which also then leads to him becoming a tyrant, very similar to Richard III from last week. And he murders the king and then blames the king's sons, and then murders his best friend Banquo and his family at the same time. So he just, at the beginning he doesn't have, well, not to say he doesn't have the capacity of evil, because that's what I'm arguing, but at the beginning he isn't portrayed as someone who is evil until the prophecy and the witches and everything just gets into his head, and it becomes so much more, well, it's desirable to want power, to need power, and so the drive for power has then created the potential for evil within Macbeth. I've looked into 3 modern day adaptations within this century. First and foremost, always check the ratings of any videos or films that I talk about to make sure that they're appropriate for you to watch. So the first one is Macbeth, an Australian film from 2006. So it's directed by Jeffrey Wright and it stars Sam Worthington in it. And it's set within a violent gang war in Melbourne, Australia, but it uses the Shakespeare language. So this is at the time where one of the television channels in Australia was producing all these crime series based on actual criminals in Australia, but obviously dramatised and fictionalised. So that's why I think the Macbeth from 2006 is, gang war Melbourne, because that was what was very popular at the time in Australia in 2006 television. The next one that I also looked at was the 2015 American Macbeth with Michael Fassbender and Marion Cotillard. This is the version that I studied with one of my classes, which uses the time and the place of the Shakespearean setting, so it was easier for them to understand the appearance and language of the time period. It was a bit weird watching it. I didn't like that one, but it's an adaptation nonetheless. The last one I was mentioning was The Tragedy of Macbeth. American, 2021. 2021. No one says 2021 anymore. It stars Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand, who I believe she got an Oscar for this, but I don't really remember. And the film was in black and white and was on a soundstage, so I haven't seen it. It sounds interesting, not quite abstract, but I'm intrigued.